So all of this has come to kind of dumb down the people. And as we saw in COVID, the people now are governed more by fear than they are by faith.
And that's where we completely ignore the absolute epidemic of pornography that we've poured out on our young people without any restrictions. We've given them a device that they can access it 24 hours a day, and it's all, and like, so you can link all this up with the contraceptive, the lack of consequences, the contraceptive mentality. Women are there for men to use sexually. That's fundamentally the message, and we're just not being honest about it.
People's whole identity is dependent on these things that they've absorbed. So it's very difficult to get into your 40s, 50s, late 30s, whatever age, realize that you've been lied to, realize that it's all part of an attempt to destroy you and your civilization. And then what do you do when you acknowledge that and admit that? That's too great a cost, like it's too much to bear. Hello and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Katherine Bennett.
I'm Mark Lambert.
And joining us is a familiar face to many of you, Fr Sean Sheehy, who's joined us from his lovely home. Well, I say lovely, we'll come to that, Father, because we were just talking about the changes of Ireland. You're welcome.
Yeah, just came back today as I was sharing with Katherine and Mark, where we prayed a rosary in the square in Tralee, praying for increasing respect for life, and especially for life in the womb, so that our country once again would respect motherhood and fatherhood, and also respect the primary purpose of sexuality, which is procreation, and so on. And so we had a pretty good turnout, even though the weather was not very favorable, but still people were there, because I think they recognize that there's such a need for prayer here in Ireland, where, for example, a study there, I think it was about 2 years ago, showed that 69% of the people in this country, only 69% now, identified as Catholic, but only 14% actually identified as practicing. So, going back to when I was a child, for example, was at least 97% of the people, were practicing. So you can see that in that number, 60 years or so, you can see what has happened to the country.
Well, we were just saying before we pressed record that you were at this public rosary, which is on the 13th of every month. We're recording today on the 13th, and you're just back from it. And we were saying time was that everyone would have been out in Ireland at something like that. What's changed then, Father, to mean that this is so decimated?
Well, I think what changed was basically that people concluded that the church had little or no meaning for them. Because I mean, we all do what has meaning for us. We invest in what is meaningful. And, when we conclude that something has no meaning for us, or isn't meaningful in some ways, or there's really no payoff, then we just don't invest in it. And I think that's what happened in this country, that people came to the conclusion that the church didn't really offer them anything. And I think much of that, I think, was definitely due to ignorance. I mean, Jesus talked about, throwing pearls before swine. And I think also a major contribution then was that the hierarchy, back in the 70s, apparently, they kind of hung their heads in shame when all of these sexual scandals began to emerge. And they seem to keep their heads hanging in shame instead of really standing up and addressing the situation for what it was, and taking the necessary steps not only to address it, but also to make sure that, as Pope Benedict himself said in a letter to Ireland at the time, that they were going to remove the filth, and I think that hasn't happened, in the sense that there's been no focus at all on moral teaching in this country. And as a result of that, then, we live in a world where there's no universal norms, there's no universal truth. So now everybody has his or her own truth, has his or her own standard for determining good and evil, and so on. And as a result, then we have people who walked away from the church. And when people walk away from something, and if those who are in charge believe that what people are walking away from is going to deprive them of something important, then to me the logical thing is that you go after those people. You go out and you search out for the lost sheep, and you point out to them, what they're depriving themselves of. But that never happened. So there's been no outreach at all to the people who've left the church. And of course, I think another contributing factor was that religious education in the schools became diluted. And a lot of times, people tell me that the religion class was kind of used for science or for some other subject that needed more time than the curriculum allotted. So the religion period then was used for something not for religion. And then, of course, also when the nuns left the convent, or they left the schools, and the brothers left the schools, they were replaced oftentimes, by lay people. Some of them were committed Catholics, but they really didn't have any background in terms of as I say, the ethos of the church, or the whole notion of the church as mission, and so on and so forth. So I think also I think television contributed to it. In Ireland, when I was growing up, it might be considered to be very kind of puritanical in some way. But you see, television actually introduced people, to the whole aspect of sexuality. They started to explain to them, the purpose of condoms and all the rest of that stuff as well. And contraception as well made a huge difference in this country. But I think people, and we saw it, for example, when the Eighth Amendment came up and people, voted to eliminate it, and the majority of these people would consider themselves to be Catholic. But they thought, you see, that being pro-choice was actually helping recognizing the freedom of the other person. Well, but there was no word actually from the hierarchy, from the clergy, explaining to them, of course, we're all pro-choice. We all have free will, but some choices are destructive. Some choices are bad. You have free will, but does that mean that you have a choice to murder? Well, you do have a choice to murder, but you would be incarcerated for it. But they never really attributed that to the whole area of abortion. Then the whole thing about same-sex marriage came up. No teaching, no education, no moral training. And then, how people, to a large extent, they voted with their feeling, not with their reason. And so the one thing that you find here in Ireland that I find is actually that reason is gone. So, now instead of arguing an issue, the tendency is just to attack the person and forget the argument itself. Because most of the time, people have no argument for their beliefs because they're just based on their feeling, and they have no idea what assumptions they're basing their beliefs on. And so when they're challenged, then they get defensive because they have nothing to fall back on. And so Ireland now, and again, this whole bit about trying to eliminate or control free speech as well. Buffer zones, for example, I don't call them abortion clinics because they're not clinics, they're mills, where human beings are actually destroyed. And now you have these buffer zones here where you can't, here in Tralee, for example, you can't pray in front of it. You have to go down the street a bit in order to pray that people will recognize that every child is a gift from God, and so on and so forth. So all of this has come to kind of dumb down the people. And as we saw in COVID, the people now are governed more by fear than they are by faith. And that's where we are. And the only way to overcome fear is to help people to understand the power of faith. Like St. Paul says, I can do all things with the strength of him who loves me. And people don't know about that, you know. At the present time, actually, I'm involved in a Zoom program. And we have about maybe 50 people on it, helping them to be able to hand on the faith to their children. Mostly, actually, they're adult children, you know, like young adults, middle adults and whatnot, who are not practicing. And so people, they want to know, how do I address this? How do I address that? What does the church teach about this and the church teach about that? And then we have a question and answer period afterwards, which is very interesting. And, you know, on last night, for example, we had a session in Tralee on how Jesus meets you in the sacraments and how you meet him in the sacraments, and the power of the sacrament when it comes to a personal relation with Jesus Christ. Now, we have about maybe 20 adults, varying ages, who are participating in that, you know, for the last number of weeks. But people are actually starving for this, and they just don't know. They just don't know. You know, I had a question where I was asked, why does the church forbid Catholics from marrying Protestants, you know? So I said, well, where'd you get that? And he said, well, I read that in something or other, you see. So I said, well, that's not really true. I said, the church encourages Catholics to marry Catholics, but it doesn't forbid marrying a Protestant, so long as you have a dispensation from the bishop. But the people just don't know. They have not been taught. That's why I think, actually, there's such a tremendous need to help people to come to know what the church teaches. Last year, there was a study done. You might have heard of a man by the name of David Quinn, who heads up the Iona Institute. On I think it's kind of on marriage and family and things like that. But anyway, they did a survey there last year among 1,000 participants. And I'll share some of the statistics with you, which is very interesting. One of the things that came out was that they showed that people were much more favorable to the church's teachings than they were to the church as institution. Now, I don't know if you may have heard of a man by the name of Marshall McLuhan. Goes way back before your time, you know, way back maybe in the 60s or so. Marshall McLuhan had a statement, and he said, the medium is the message. The medium is the message. But this survey seemed to think that, like, the medium was not the message. It was the message rather than the medium. But then again, to me, there's always a close relationship between the medium and the message. And so if the medium is not really living the message, you know, then the message is somewhat diluted. Because you remember what Jesus said to the Pharisees, to the people. He said, do what they tell you, he said, but don't do what they do. Because what they do is not in accord with faith in God and so on. So, and the same thing, so here you see again that people are looking for solid teaching. They're looking for something that is based on a solid, on a foundation. They're also looking for a structure in which they can find security and which they can trust as well. And that's what's missing here. The church as institution is not trustworthy, not because of the church herself, but because of her leaders. I mean, I met a man last week, and he said, I just left a mass, he said, and I came out drained, he said, because of the this is how he put it, because of the carry-on in the church. People were running around, the priest was kind of making a joke out of it, and so on. And So he said, I don't think I'm going to go back. Anyway, I said, look, don't cut off your nose to spite your face, I said, go back, confront the priest and tell him that you do feel drained and that you're not, experiencing the presence of God because you think it's being undermined. So to a large extent, the Mass here in this country has become a form of entertainment. And as a result, the focus is on the people. And how would I put it? A lot of priests, not a lot, but some priests, they want the people to like them. And so they come across as entertaining and funny and, watering things down and all the rest of that stuff as well. But I do think, though, that that people are fed up with the woke culture. They're fed up with virtue signaling. And I think they want the creed on stilts. They as a man said to me, he said, I just went to confession, he said, and I just came back out, he said, and I just felt, why did I even bother to go? And I said, well, what did you expect? He said, well, I wanted the priest, and this is his own words, I wanted the priest to hit me. He said, I want him to hit me. And I wanted him to tell me, look, you better stop this or else, kind of stuff as well.
That sounds like Katherine. Katherine goes for that.
What's that?
Sounds like Katherine, Father.
I was telling Mark that I went to confession yesterday, and there's a very lovely priest, and I went in, and he was so jolly. He said, "Hello, what a lovely day," and blah blah. And I said my sins, and one of which was I have fallen by the wayside in my Lenten commitments. And he said, well, it's likely that you've made them too difficult. Why not change them and make them easier? And that way you won't fail. And I sort of said, I came out and I did, listened to the priest penance. But I was laughing because we were talking about the mission recently, weren't we, Mark? That scene in the mission where he goes in and he has this absolution, but still carries this boulder up a hill, doesn't he, Mark? You tell the story very well. That sense that, yes, you need to be absolved of your sin, but also recognizing the gravity of it.
Punishment has to fit the crime.
Yeah.
It's a quote.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking to somebody this past week, and they were kind of lamenting the fact that they were not, doing enough, for the Lord, and I said, well, the fact is you can never do enough for the Lord. I mean, that's the reality. Yeah. But I said, what you do, you have to put your heart and soul into, and never really to be complacent, never really to be satisfied with yourself. Because, when it comes to discipline, we can never discipline ourselves enough. We tend to put limits on our discipline as well.
Well, that goes to what you were saying, Father, about priests being nice. What we've had is decades now of priests saying, oh, it doesn't matter fundamentally. And if it, I think we've got to the stage where a lot of people have started to believe them. It doesn't matter. And that's really the problem. But when you think about even before Christianity, the early Greek philosophers, what were the questions they were asking? The big question was, yes, how do I live a virtuous life? Or how do I live a good life? And the answer was through the virtues. So even before Christianity, this was the impetus driving men forward. And in lots of ways, we've undermined that in the last few decades, saying that actually it's about doing whatever you feel, as you said earlier. That's the problem, isn't it? And where are the bishops? Like you're saying, why aren't they coming out and challenging these things? And it's not difficult to do. All you have to do is say, this is why, like contraception, what a great example. How many times do I get asked about contraception? And if you start saying that, if you remove the procreative end of marriage, then you end up with a situation where any sexual action is based on consent. So then it becomes meaningless. And then, of course, everything follows from there, doesn't it? And no one really understands any of this anymore. Even there was a Protestant clergyman that I was talking to earlier in the week who said, oh, it's women priests. Women priests is what's led to all the homosexuality and all this. I was like, it's not that at all. It's contraception. It's 1930, the Lambert Council. That's exactly what the problem is.
What's interesting is Protestants don't in my experience, seem to see that. They're kind of with you when you say, oh, this woke culture or the women bishops, and they're like, yeah, you tell it like it is. And then you say contraception, they're like, oh, hang on a minute. I don't see what the problem with contraception
is. They want to hang
is.
on to that.
Yeah, they want to and it's like you can't see, and yet I think it's clear, but as you say, the church hasn't taught this clearly. It's clear that once you pull at that thread, you unravel everything: transgender ideology, surrogacy, IVF, gay marriage. It all goes back to contraception, and that needs to be addressed, doesn't it, Father?
It does, because I mean, Pope Paul VI himself, he said actually that if contraception becomes the order of the day, he said, the next thing, he said, will be abortion, because when contraception doesn't work, then abortion will become a form of contraception as well. And then, of course, like I just saw, for example, in the US right now, they're trying to put limitations on the abortion pill by mail because of the destructiveness it's having on women, most of whom actually are past maybe a 12-week period before they take this pill, and they are rushed to clinics from bleeding and all the rest of that stuff as well. But I think that's why I think that there's a real need to, like for you, talk about presenting the actual teaching of the church, to your audience. And I do think that focusing actually on the moral aspect is very important, because that's the practical side of the faith, really. And like you're talking about, contraception, like when you say, look, contraception actually is contrary to, it's an abuse, first of all, of sexuality as created by God. It's contrary to the natural law, because, no mother wants to destroy her, no female wants to destroy her young, even the animals, never mind a human being. And also, it's a total lack of faith, because a child, I do believe, no matter even an extremely handicapped child, is a gift from God, because every child has a gift. And so God is being slapped in the face, and the community is being deprived of the gifts of all these children. Now we hear people talking about countries, where the population growth is not meeting the death growth, so to speak. And why is it? You see, and you see how horrible it is. In Ireland, for example, this past year, 108 babies survived abortion, and some of them were left there to die afterwards as well. Now, that is totally inhumane. I mean, if you saw a little puppy, being attacked by its mother, your instinct is to rescue it. So it's contrary to human nature.
But Father, it's contrary to human nature for a mother to want to kill her child, and to get to the point where mothers do choose that, you have to manipulate language and place a veil over our eyes, so that we don't consider that is in fact what we're doing. And so, to what extent do you think it's actually, there has to be this addressed philosophically in terms of what's happening? The first question is, when does life begin? Because it's been a very successful campaign to have women think that this is not what they're doing, killing their own child.
Right. Of course, I mean, the old story is, well, the zygote or the fetus is just a clump of cells, you see. Yeah. I think the philosophical side is that it's not a person. It's not a person. You say, well, what constitutes a person? You see, I mean, if you're a person outside the womb, you have to be a person inside the womb, because birth itself doesn't suddenly make
the idea that the birth canal magically changes you.
Right, exactly.
And then you stop being a person when you're in space or underwater, because you rely on some other equipment to keep you alive. So then you're not a person.
I mean, the irony is, of course, then, that somehow or other that the child in the womb is being deprived of being a person. It's only when the child is outside the womb it's a person. And that's a philosophical question, you see. But by the same token, when you look at the word person actually comes from Latin, as you know, and it simply means a mask. It means the way you present yourself as well. And I mean, mothers know, for example, that there's life within them, as you know better than I do, because, and actually that video, the silent scream, proves it, to show that the child in the womb is susceptible to pain because it was taken actually during an abortion. And you could see actually in the video the fetus, and the word fetus itself means little one,
baby,
moving away from the forceps that was being used to try to grasp the child and pull it out of the womb to abort it.
Unbelievable.
See,
it is so horrendous. But the other thing about that is, I think that this is a form of consequentialism, because like, this is downstream of contraception again. Like, this change that came in 1930. Before then, all the Christian churches were agreed that contraception was wrong. And once you've said, oh, well, like in it, and you can see the argument, the way the argument was constructed, that people want to have sex without consequences. And this is the means to allow that to happen. But of course it fails. And then there are consequences. So what do we do about those consequences? Well, let's introduce the Abortion Act, and that will sort that problem out. And it's just one like problem. Slope. One problem leads to another.
Yeah. But you see, the fact is, that the governments themselves are facing the fact that they lie by promoting abortion. Because if they have to create buffer zones around these places where abortions are taking place, then what they're saying is that they have to protect something that they think is a person's right, and they're afraid. Then you see that. I mean, what's unconscionable to me is when they don't want a woman persuaded to keep her child. I mean, that's just beyond me, And every time actually that women are persuaded to keep their child, they're always grateful. They're always thankful that they were persuaded. But these governments, you see, are trying to make sure that doesn't happen, And in Ireland, for example, last year, there were 12,500 abortions. 12,500 births. And of the 12,500 births, 12,500, there were 2,600 women in that three-day period that's still there in Ireland who changed their minds. 26. So there are 26 children in Ireland now who were saved actually by that 3 days waiting while the women had an opportunity to think about. But instead of 3 days, it should be 3 months, thinking about it. Is this really what I want to do?
I just can't believe Ireland has gone down that road.
Because I've worked with women, you see, who've had abortions, especially young women.
Yeah.
And it is a crisis, there's no doubt about it. And very often, like there was a study done in America there way back in I think it was around the 80s, that showed that actually that women was among women who had abortions, and that I think it was over 86% of them said if left to themselves, they would never have had an abortion. So therefore, then the pressure came, from outside. See, and you never hear that talked about. You never really hear that addressed. But I think also, I remember in America actually, when parents way back in the 70s, they started giving artificial birth control to their daughters, which to me was an insult to these teenage girls.
It's absolutely, it's rife now. This is a young girl goes to the doctor now with skin trouble or mood swings or anything that I think would just be part of natural, growing up and being a teenager, and they're immediately medicated. We mustn't forget, of course, that Margaret Sanger was one of the funders of the first contraceptive pill, and she was a eugenicist, a racist eugenicist. We were just at Brixton outside the abortion clinic.
I saw your video.
Yeah, and that was very intentionally set up in a black area to target the black community. And I think not enough of this is shared. They're so keen to put on this smiley face of care, and you're treated like a 5-star hotel while they rip your baby out from you. Right. And you think, seriously, are we selling this as women's rights? Are we selling this as a good thing, that you're reducing a population that you think are unworthy to exist, and we think that's equality, whether you're black or and the pills by post scheme is another one of these things, Mark, that's like this one thing leads to another. This is very cynical. You allow pills by post knowing that will be abused, knowing that women will seek pills after 12 weeks, going to hospital in a terrible state and needing surgery as justification to launch from and say, now we need to allow abortion up to birth because otherwise it's going to be terrible for these women, just like the backstreet abortion argument that allowed for abortion in the first place to be legalized. So it's all part of a push to say, let's try and get rid of the babies.
And it's amazing that they've got, like people like MPs, members of parliament here, like Stella Creasy and Rupert Hutcliffe. They're pushing all the time for more extreme measures, that there's no waiting period, that children are allowed to be killed up to birth. What drives? I just don't understand how we've got to this position in our society. Yeah,
it's the same here in Ireland. Actually, there's one by the name of Coppinger who is pushing to get rid of the 3-day waiting period immediately, just abortion, on demand. But I've always viewed abortion, you see, as the newest form of racism, because racism is all about a group of people looking on another group as less human than they are. And because they view them as less human, then they think they can do with them as they want. I mean, that's the way it was in America, for example, with the slaves and the Indians. They saw them as actually less human. They call the Indians savages, and it was actually one of the popes, who wrote a letter saying, look, these people have a soul just like you do, they're just as human. But to me, abortion is racist because you have this group of people being looked on as being less human than others. And that to me is racism.
So much for savages. We've become savage. Savage. We think we're civilized and we're genociding babies in the womb. We're trying to bump off the elderly and the irritating and the inconvenient. And we're consuming pornography and giving up on marriage and giving up on children and families. We're savages.
We often talk about that like cycle as well. It's always, it seems to always be on the news over here about, like this, the latest thing is, the manosphere and the fact, and there's all this negative sort of way of treating women that's getting more and more prevalent, and incels, involuntary celibate males, and all this sort of thing. And yet we completely ignore the absolute epidemic of pornography that we've poured out on our young people without any restrictions. We've given them a device that they can access it 24 hours a day, and it's all, and like, so you can link all this up with the contraceptive, the lack of consequences, the contraceptive mentality. Women are there for men to use sexually. That's fundamentally the message. And we're just not being honest about it, are we?
No, I just saw there where in Australia, a woman has sued the government because her 14-year-old daughter was exposed to what she described as pornography in the schools, disguised as sex education. Same thing is true here in this country. There's another case now being pushed by a woman here also, which is very interesting, because she was in a car wreck and she was pregnant and her child died as a result of the car wreck. So now she's pushing the government to declare her child a person, with a name and so on and so forth. So it's going to be very interesting to see if that goes through, because if the government declares this unborn child a person, then that totally weakens their argument. You see that the unborn child is just a clump of cells.
Well, you'd think so. I mean, that's one thing that we've seen over here a lot, is this. There is an amazing amount of cognitive dissonance, with the people who support abortion. They'll say that if you've had a miscarriage, which is an unforced abortion, isn't it?
Right.
Where like what we're talking about, that procedure is a forced medical abortion. So it's like, and they will say that was a baby. But if you have an abortion, and you can see it's exactly what Katherine said, that they're controlling the language in order to manufacture the outcome that they require. And there's no consistency, no logic behind any of this at all. It's just try an attempt to manipulate us.
And I think the problem is that for so long, people's whole lives, people's whole identity is dependent on these things that they've absorbed. So it's very difficult to get into your 40s, 50s, late 30s, whatever age, realize that you've been lied to, realize that it's all part of an attempt to destroy you and your civilization. And then what do you do when you acknowledge that and admit that? That's too great a cost, like it's too much to bear. And I think people somehow deep down do know, but they don't want to admit it, so they double down. This is what we see all the time, is doubling down. It's like politicians whose policies fail. What do? We don't say our policies have failed, let's start again with something different. We double down because it's too hard. It's too hard for the human soul perhaps to acknowledge quite the scale of the lies that have destroyed us.
Very true. And it also shows, you see, that Satan has a real grip, you see, on people. I mean, we do live actually, physically in Satan's kingdom. I mean, that's the reality. Satan is not in hell. Satan is in the world, and he's alive and well. And that's what the people need to hear, because a lot of people don't even realize what's happening to them. I mean, I think a lot of people's problems, psychological problems, emotional problems, social problems, are actually due to sin. They're due to the fact that their souls are starved, that their souls are malnourished. And, like I think we're saying, Luke, who said, out of the abundance and the heart, comes the man's words, you see. So what's in our heart, is the result of what we feed our souls with. And again, here you see is where and Jesus obviously knew quite well why he founded his church, within which he would be present in order to counteract this evil. But the leadership, the dominant leadership of the church, treat the church as if it were some kind of an NGO, that's their organization, that they can do whatever they want with, like going back to the Playboy philosophy way back in the 50s, that sex is purely for pleasure. There's no feelings, there's no commitment, there's no relationship, nothing, And then sadly, despite all this emphasis, on equality with women then are used and abused and thrown away. But they don't seem to realize that.
No. And it's not that we've got it. It's not that we were like. I don't think any of us are saying either that it was right. There was some golden time in the 50s or something where we had all this right. But I think
there was. What are you talking about?
No, where I think that the fundamental point is, if you follow what the church teaches in this regard, that is the proper way to for men and women to have a relationship. And it's not that not that people have got that right in the past or something like that. This is something that we all need to work on. And there are examples obviously of terrible things being done to women, and we had a brilliant conversation with Dr. Carrie Gress where I think we talked about some of the advances, like if you spoke to a young woman and said, feminism's a load of rubbish, they'll probably go, what are you on about? Like, should we go back to women being treated as chattels? And the point is, that's not what the church teaches. The church teaches that men should sacrifice. That this is what the proper relationship should be, like Christ and the church, isn't it? So
like the point is, sin is sin. Sin is sin. The church has never taught that sin is good.
That's right.
But people have always been sinful, whether it's now 100 years ago, 200 or 300 years ago. Father, let me ask this question. Why doesn't God want us to sin? Is it because he's a horrible, grumpy old being who just wants to make our lives difficult? Or is it something else, Father?
God doesn't want us to sin simply because he does not want us he does to deprive ourselves of the love that he wants to bestow on us. God hates sin, and he loves the sinner. He loves the sinner because he wants the sinner to eliminate the sin so that he can be the beneficiary of his love. I mean, as I think it was St. Thomas Aquinas said one time, that happiness is an end in itself. Well, actually, love is an end in itself as well, because there is no human being who does not want to be loved. And sin is fake love. And because it's fake love, it will leave all those who fall into it feeling cheated, disappointed, and empty and deprived. And that's the reality. Sin is actually turning away from what a person was created for, because God created every person out of love, for love, and to love. Sin actually then is an attempt to love ourselves in accord with our selfish desires, so that if we satisfy our selfishness, then we'll be happy, then we'll feel loved. And of course, that's not true. The four false gods, are pleasure, popularity, possessions, and what's the other one? Poverty, possessions, popularity, and I forget the song. But anyway,
Power,
exactly, power. So that's what the world promotes. If you have these, you're going to be happy. If you have these, you're going to have love. You say, what not?
And that's what the Beatitudes are addressing.
Precisely.
When they turn on its head all the things that the world tells you make you happy, and Jesus says no, this, and we know it. The thing is, we're such fools because we do it and we're like, nah, I reckon the power and the money and the stuff will make me happy. And we were talking before we started recording about suicide and suicide rates, and there's a very clear correlation between societies that have all of those things that the world says make you happy, and it doesn't work, and we know it.
Right. Now, you know yourself better than I. How many times do you have to remind your children of things that you've said to them over and over again?
Every day, every 5 minutes.
And you see, that's the way I see the bishops and the clergy.
Yeah.
Their job is to remind the people, not beat them over the head, or talk down to them, but to remind the people over and over and over again of what God is calling us to be, and as a result of being, doing. But if that's not there, just, if you don't remind your children over and over again, what are they going to do? They're going to do what's easiest or what's convenient.
I love that. I love that passage at the end of Deuteronomy when, he says, like Moses standing before the Holy Land, and he says, what the Lord has put in front of you, life or death. Therefore, choose life. And live. Be happy, but this is what God is saying to us. And the trouble is, when we choose our own selfishness, we turn away from God. We make a decision. We say non serviam, don't we? We turn away from God's will for us, which is the best thing that we can do in our lives. And we choose to be selfish and turn inward and turn away. And the wages of that sin are death.
That's right. And but then you see when your priest tells you then, oh, you're fine, you're doing great as you are and whatnot. And there's no challenge.
Yeah.
One of the things that I found in my time as teaching, especially in high school and even in university as well, that the higher expectations, the more they rose to it. The less your expectations, the less they did.
Where do you set the bar? Yeah, I spent years teaching, as you know, Father, and that's absolutely true. You have that low bar and you say you're not, in a way, it's just not respecting them or their dignity.
Yes.
It's saying you can only reach this far, you filthy little idiots. Here you go. Well done. Give you a gold star for being breathing and being like the animals that are around you that do the same thing as, it's like, it doesn't call them to anything, does it?
No, and I mean, that's what Jesus did, wasn't it? If Jesus only taught the apostles what they could understand, he would have been finished in 5 minutes. But he taught them,
be holy like your Father in heaven is holy, doesn't he?
That's right, exactly.
What could be more, higher bar than that?
Yeah. Actually, even last night, a woman said, "Did he really mean that?" I said, "Yes, he did." So Don't stay in your comfort zone and think, oh yeah, I'm doing fine as I am. No, and that doesn't mean either, like, of course you have to be careful when you're talking to perfectionists, too, because that can bother them. But yes, because we're all capable of more and more and more and more, and we need people to pull us out of ourselves. And so we need the bishops, we need the priests to pull us out of ourselves. And I mean, look at St. Paul, what he went through. And the very same power that St. Paul had is available to all of us through the church again. But if we don't hear it, we don't believe it. But when we hear it, it's like the woman in the gospel, who was treated unjustly by the judge, and she kept banging away on his door, and he didn't get up out of charity, but out of annoyance to get her off his back.
I love that story. I have to say,
absolutely,
it's one of my favorite stories. Yeah,
exactly.
And I was going to say, to me, the way that I've worked all this out in my mind very much is that, like, it's not that you're, obviously we've got our Blessed Mother as a model to say this is something that we can achieve. But the way that I like to think about it is the Greek idea of theosis. That the way supernatural grace works in our lives.
That's right.
And I find that the closer, this is why it annoys me, Katherine knows, when, some priests say, oh, I'm the worst sinner out of all of you. And I think, well, what's the point?
Yes.
Father Lemelson said that to us. It's like, well, what's the point of listening to you then?
Exactly.
Like if it's not having an effect on you, if the grace of living your life in accordance with the teachings, the precepts of the Lord aren't affecting you, then what's the point in following it? And it does affect us. The sacraments do affect us, and as they affect us, it gets easier, and you start to listen. You can hear the Lord's word and in your life a lot easier, and that, I think, is the thing that's modeling us. Because like for us, for that life of glory, after the resurrection, because the whole project is a movement into the Trinity, isn't it? It is.
Actually, it's been pulled into the Trinity, yes. And then that's where the transformation takes place. When you're sitting, between the Father and the Son, and you're there because of their love for one another, that's pulling you in there. You can't help but be transformed. But you see, I mean, we need to hear that, you see. Like Paul says, faith comes through hearing, hearing comes through preaching, preaching comes through those who are being sent out. So if those who are sent out don't preach, then there's nothing to hear. And if there's nothing to hear, then the faith will deteriorate. That's what is happening in this country, in Ireland.
Well, to that point, Father, you were talking to us about Dublin, where we've got Father Pat Fitzgerald, who's the interim administrator of Mount Argus Parish, who basically gave a homily recently where he compared the reception of Holy Communion on the tongue and at the altar rail with how animals are fed. That was a really good homily, wasn't it?
Absolutely disgraceful, And also when he said as well that we don't go to mass to worship God. I mean, what kind of
you wonder if everyone just walked out at that point. I'd have just got up and gone.
Yeah, I mean,
what am I here for then?
It's madness that can even be spoken. Those words can be spoken.
Yeah, but I mean, I think about 4 years ago, there was a bishop actually in Peru who said that Jesus Christ was a layman. He was not a priest. And I'm thinking, did you ever read the scriptures? Did you ever read the letter to the Hebrews? I mean, and no sanction, No. And actually, I think it was Pope Francis, who said, he said abortion is actually, killing a human being. And he said, but it's debatable as to whether or not it's a person. I mean, that is the foundation for everything. It's debatable. Well, it's not debatable.
That's just linguistic games.
When people say those things, they don't realize the impact, on them, and that's what's frightening.
Yeah.
But like when you were talking about that priest, Mark, who said, "I'm a terrible sinner," what he should have said is, "I'm going to be judged much more harshly than you are,"
Yeah, and he did. Funny enough, he did correct himself, didn't he, Katherine?
Good.
And said that was what he meant. You know, which was like, you know, we were like, oh,
and I was
right,
glad.
okay.
I was glad you picked him up on that, because that is a point that is worth addressing. It's interesting. The priest there you mentioned in Dublin talked about animals, like feeding like animals. Because I was thinking when you were talking earlier, Father, just a moment ago, about that call, you know, that theosis, that call into the life of the Trinity, that is unique to humans. We are Imago Dei, and this is something that is beautiful, good, true, wonderful. And you think, what are we saying? My dog can breathe, so can I. My dog can eat, me too. He can enjoy food, so can I. He can have sex, me too. Even have babies, me too. But there comes a point where
he can't have babies.
Well, he can't. Well, I don't know. It's 2026. Come on. But there comes a point. I've got a girl dog as well. There comes a point where you are separate from the beasts. And the fact that we're separate from the beast is a great thing. Why do we settle for that which the beasts can enjoy and say, guess what? You can have sex. Can I? Yeah, without consequence. Brilliant. And eat nice food. Good for you. It's like, so I'm happy to go through life no better than the beasts around me. This is saying you are
called for something
made in the image and likeness of our Lord. And like Benedict says, the world offers you comfort. The world will offer you comfort, but you're not made for comfort. No. You're made for greatness. This is what we need to hear.
And this is why we've got this epidemic of suicide in Ireland. Because that's been rejected now. And it's almost worse, because what they've done is they've got to the point where, well, whatever the truth is, it isn't that. You know, it isn't Catholicism. It isn't what we've been following for the last few years. And they've rejected it out of hand. And that, to me, falls on the shoulders of those bishops and priests, you know, who failed to preach those truths, Father, doesn't it?
It does. And you see then the world, you see, says, well, you know, if you don't like yourself, you don't like your body, okay, then you can go through surgery, you know, and you can change it, you know, to be whatever it is you think you want. Huh? Yeah. I mean, it's awful. It's just awful. This is what the world offers, which of course again is a total lie, you know, because as I've often said, you know, you go back to the philosophers, you know, where the soul is the form of the body, you know, so your body actually reflects your soul. So if your body is female, then actually, in a sense, your soul is female. If your body is male, your soul is female. Well, you might change the body, you know, physically, but you can't change your soul. See, you can't change your DNA. So on the one hand, they say follow the science, and on the other hand, they totally reject science, which again means that they're really disingenuous. You see, and that's Satan. To me, that's Satan. As Satan is a liar. He's a liar, but he frames his lies as being good for you. Like Eve, oh, look at that fruit, look at it. It looks so tasty, and
you'll be like God. Yeah,
exactly. Be like God. Exactly right. And
but this is again in education, that complete loss of that Thomistic thinking, that Aristotelian thought, the idea of the telos,
and the idea of logic.
The idea of logic, the idea of, you talk about the soul being the form, the idea of formality and finality has all been sacrificed and sideswept for an emphasis on efficiency, the efficient cause and the material cause. So everything is just about what you're made of, and not where you've come from, where you're going, why you take the form that you do. And I think in education, unless we address that again, and that's why I think there is now, I think, an emergence of schools, you know, classical schools who recognise that this is something lost that needs to be recovered.
And I think they're going back again to the classics, you know, too, to study the classics. I remember when I was in America, corporations actually used to have to send some of their employees back to school to learn how to write a proposal. You know, they had all kinds of scientific background, but they couldn't write a proposal that made sense. So they sent them back to school to learn how, you know. because they've never been taught, and that's the problem. And I think today, students are not being taught how to think at all. Like, there's no focus on critical thinking. So that's why the media then has such a grip on people, because there's no analytical approach to it. There's no questioning. They don't even know the questions to ask. Then they accept it as is, as if it were true. How many times have I heard people, quote the Irish Independent or the Irish Times and so on and so forth, as if what was there was absolute truth, when actual fact it wasn't. And last night after and one of the great things, after our sessions in Tralee is we sit down for about an hour afterwards to have a debate, discussion, and people bring up all kinds of questions. And people say, look, you can't have that outside. People just don't want to sit down and converse. They don't want to sit down and debate, you see, because there's a problem now that if I disagree with you, then I'm offending you.
Yeah.
And I love that woman. I love that woman in England, Katie Hopkins, who says the only one that can offend me is myself. I said, good for you. And
yeah.
I saw there early the week, somebody sent me a text, and it said that if you're upset because somebody insults you, and you're pleased because somebody praises you, you're a slave.
Yeah, that's a very wise thing to say, isn't it?
Isn't it? And the goal should be actually, self-possession, and only the Lord can help us to possess ourselves, to own ourselves, and then take responsibility for ourselves.
Yeah.
And when there's an emphasis on responsibility, I remember in teaching high school, and you have probably done that yourself, I would ask the students, who are the stakeholders in your decisions? Like, when you decide who's affected by your decision, most of them didn't think anybody was affected, which is just when I decide. And then when they started, and invariably, one of them would say, well, if you looked at it that way, you'd never make a decision. I said, well, maybe you shouldn't then make a decision, because no matter what you say, you're affecting somebody. So do you want to affect them? Like when I was thinking about that young man who committed suicide, look at all the people who are affected by his decision, and it's long term. Another thing I would ask the students as well was, how many of you love your parents? And they would all probably raise their hands. How many of you have ever actually done something against their wishes? And of course the hands would go up. So I said, that means then that you disobeyed them, you see? And I would say, and at the same time, you say you love them. But if you love somebody, if you love your parents, you would not disobey them. So those are times actually when you showed you did not love your parents. And they'd look at each other, and so on and so forth, because most of them were guilty of doing something. But that sense of responsibility, which of course ultimately is adult.
Yeah.
But I do think that's where the church has such a powerful role to play. As you said, to say, look, you are God's gifted child, and He has placed you in the world to save the world. That's your role. And He's equipped you through the sacraments, and He's always with you, and so on. And in that way, then you're part of the solution to the world's problems. You're not part of the problems themselves. And I think most people really want to be part of the solution. They don't really want to be part of the problem, but they don't know how to be part of the solution.
Yeah.
Very
yeah.
true.
Well, we've run up to an hour now. Father, maybe you'll come and join us as we discover the catechism together in future.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well,
and we pray that the synodal way, will actually give way to the way of the cross.
Amen.
Amen. Amen to that. Okay, thank you, Father, for your time this afternoon.
Thank you. It was a privilege.
You're bathed in light. You're bathed in light, Father, as you've been speaking. The sun.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your witness as well, and for your work.
Yeah,
we need more of it.
Thanks, Father.
Well, by God's grace,
to know that you're reducing your purgatory time.
Please God, not making it worse.
Thank you, Father. Thank you for your friendship, for your support, and for joining us. And you'll
You're
be back
welcome.
to talk with us again soon. Thank you to all of you for watching. Please visit our website, catholicunscripted.com. And if you're able to, please support us with a subscription so that we can continue to have great conversations like this. But for now, thank you. God bless. Goodbye.
God bless.
Thank you very much. Yeah.